Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, which is one of 17 Ashlands in the country. So I just like to say that we're, in the best state ever. I am so excited to be here with Shannon Reed talking about her book, Why We Read on Bookworms, Libraries in Just One Page Before Lights Out. When I read that title, I was like, one page. This is a perfect book for us. So I'm super excited to have this conversation. But before I get to Shannon, I wanted to say a couple things. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming, as well as Shannon for letting us share this program with other libraries, because when libraries get together, we just make magic. And I feel like this book is a perfect combination of library magic and book magic. So it's really exciting and special. You can buy signed books from Shannon at Aesop's Fable. I'll put a link to that in the chat, as well as in the recap email that I send out to everybody. And if you have questions for Shannon, this is just a Q&A, no slides, anything like that. If you have questions for her, put them in the Q&A, which is at a button at the bottom of your screen. I will be paying attention to the chat, but it usually goes by too quickly for me to pull all the questions. So feel free to chat with each other throughout our conversation, but please use the Q&A for your questions. So Shannon Reed, who wrote a book about books and reading, I just think that's ideal. And
right? Well,
exactly, is a professor at in Pittsburgh, but she's a writer, she's a humorist, she's like does sort of like everything. And she was also a librarian for a short time. She worked as a page in a library. So she just has the entire book gamut. And so I'm very thrilled to have you here, Shannon. I can't wait to talk about this book. But before we start talking about the book specifically, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
of course, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much to all the attendees who came out on a Thursday night. I love a good Zoom book chat on a Thursday night. This is just the time of the week where I want to start talking about books. So thank you all for coming out for this. Yeah, this is my second book. My first book is called Why Did I Get a B? And Other Mysteries We're Discussing in the Faculty Lounge. And it is a memoir about my teaching career. I've taught pre-K, middle school, high school, and now I am a professor at Pitt, as you mentioned, University of Pittsburgh. There, I teach in the creative writing program. I also got my MFA in creative writing from Pitt. So I'm a real Pitt girl. I have been there for a long time, since 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And otherwise, I feel like a lot of people know my work. If not from my two books, from my humor writing for McSweeney's Internet Tendency and The New Yorker. But I also am an essayist. I write articles. I'm working on a novel, a little bit of everything. I used to be a playwright, truly a little bit of everything.
So writer at heart. So again, before we get into the book, I definitely want to ask you if a little bit about your history. Like, have you always been a reader?
Yeah, absolutely. My grandmother taught me to read when I was 2 years old. Right, talk a little bit about that in the preface that I'm going to read. So I won't go into too much detail with that. But yeah, I don't know. I just have always really identified with reading. It seems to me both the perfect thing that you can combine it with doing something else. You can commute in New York, where I lived for 15 years. You can be on the subway and read and sort of lose yourself in a book, but you can also just sit at home and read. It's so engrossing. I think, I'm sorry, I don't remember which writer it was, but some writer had a great quote about writing lets you live two lives at once.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like reading does that too. You have your own life and whatever's happening to you and for you and with you. And then you have your book and the world that's going on in there. And I love that about it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. And then I think about those people that read multiple books at a time, which I cannot do, and they're living in all these worlds at the same time. I just think that would be really fascinating. So what kind of books did you read when you were a kid?
I loved all kinds of books. I particularly was interested in chapter books from a very young age. And that was a little tricky for my parents and teachers and librarians, because as I read about in the book, I was also a scaredy cat. I was scared of absolutely everything. I would I was scared of the woman yelling, "Hey, you guys," at the beginning of the electric company. Like I lived in fear at all times. And so it was a little tricky to find books that were challenging enough for me to be involved in them, to be interested in them. I was just past the point where a picture book or a book with minimum text would be helpful for me or be interesting for me. So instead, I would read chapter books like Little House on the Prairie was deemed kind of okay. And I know that there are some real issues with the Little House on the Prairie books. Like I know that as an adult, but as a kid, I was just like, no monsters are gonna eat anyone in this book. So fantastic. I read the Anne of Green Gables book. I definitely was a little obsessed with Little Women. I read an abridged copy. I didn't realize it was abridged until I was much older. I also just like read whatever was around. I read my mom's Good Housekeeping magazines. I read my dad's, like church stuff because he was a pastor. I read cereal boxes. I just wanted to read whatever was in front of me. It was my primary way of getting information as a
Mhm. And so when did you think that you were going to be a writer?
oh gosh, that's a great question. I always wrote. I definitely considered myself somebody who needed to express myself in writing from a fairly young age. I enjoyed, and I still really enjoy this about writing, I enjoyed learning what I thought and felt by writing. Even now, somebody might ask me how I feel about a topic or a person or a film or a book or something like that. And I know, but I can't fully articulate it until I start writing. So in that sense, I conceived of myself as a writer from a young age. Like I like to sit and sort of go through my thoughts and figure out what they were and articulate what it is I wanted to say. But I also thought simultaneously that writers were like old white guys with Arthur Miller glasses. Like I just had a very specific image of Arthur Miller. That's what a writer looks like. I am not Arthur Miller, so therefore I could not be a writer. I also, I grew up in a small city in Western Pennsylvania mostly, and I didn't know any writers. And I also was told constantly by people around me, by my family, by my teachers, by really well-meaning people who only wanted to help me, that writing was something that was really, really hard to do, and very few people got to do it. And you probably had to live in New York City, and you probably had to be like, or like really eccentric and be Flannery O'Connor or something like that. Like those were the choices. And I was like, well, I don't live in New York City and I'm not that eccentric. And I just don't think that I'm gonna be able to do that. So, and I don't look like a writer. This is a very long-winded way of saying, like, I didn't think that was something that I could be
Mhm.
until probably my mid-30s. And then I had written some plays, and I had started to think of myself as a person who at least could write plays. And I thought, well, if I could get into an MFA program and have 2 or 3 years to just do some writing, I could see if maybe that would be a thing that I could be at least some of the time, or at least a little bit of myself.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's so really it was late. It was my
Mhm.
mid-30s, so I really started thinking of myself as a writer.
So it's never too late.
True, it's very
What,
true.
so what did you, just really out of curiosity, like what did you do up until your 30s to like
In
pay your
terms
bills?
of artistic expression, or just yeah,
Just like making money.
I taught. I was a
Oh, that's
teacher.
right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was just like when I got 2 degrees in theater.
Mhm.
Um, I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in theater. And if my best friend who went to college with me was in the room, he would make sure that I say it is a performance degree. It was an acting. Um, and then I got, just a few years later, I got a master's in educational theater from NYU, which allowed me to teach theater and English at a high school level. So I
Mhm.
was like, great, these are really practical jobs. I'm still in touch with the arts. I still, to this day, really love theater. This is a great way for me to be involved in helping shape future artists and creating art in a different way. And I loved that work. I just came to realize fairly early on that I was an artist myself, and
Mhm.
that work, while meaningful and beautiful, and I still really treasure doing it, was not feeding the artist in me, that I needed to think about that as well, even if it wasn't going to be a career and I wasn't going to be making a ton of money at it, that I had to have both in my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. So Eva Jane asked a really good question. Did you encourage your students to read because you were you were teaching theater? Were you also encouraging them to read other
Yeah, I
things other
teach
than
theater
plays?
and English. In New
Okay.
York City, you can teach theater as a full-time job, which is great. I have a couple of close friends who are still teaching theater, but mostly you're going to need to teach English and not be able to teach theater as your only subject, which was fine by me. I always really loved teaching English. And yeah, I loved trying to get my students to read. I have a couple stories in the book about doing things like dragging them to the public library in Brooklyn and literally bribing one of them to get a library card by saying I would give him a stick of gum if he would apply for it and take a library card. I was always trying to emphasize to them. So I was teaching high school in like the early 21st century, where we didn't have quite the access to media that we do now. There wasn't as much, there wasn't really any streaming, and the internet wasn't quite as accessible as it is now. And so I had students who were queer, or were starting to think that they were queer, or had ambitions beyond the kind of rough neighborhood that they were growing up in. And I just really consistently tried to say to them, like, read. You're going to see queer people, you're going to see questioning people, you're going to see people who are in the same place you are.
Mhm.
um, Even if you can't quite articulate where that place is. And television is great, and movies are great. I love them both. But for like the nuance and the specificity, a book is really what's going to get you.
Mhm.
And in my book, in Why We Read, I have a couple of essays about different ways my students connected with works unexpectedly that I had assigned to them. There's specifically one about reading Jane Eyre with the all-girls high school that I taught at in Rockaway, Queens, which is on the beach in Queens. And these girls were like, they were amazing, but they were tough New York City, like half surfer, half urban girls, who wore their big door knocker earrings with their like bikinis and went out surfing. And I was like, Jane Eyre. Like, I don't know. I don't know if this is gonna work. Um, but you know what? They loved it. Like, spoiler alert, they absolutely loved it because they saw in Jane a characteristic that I hadn't even thought of. They saw that she was trying to become her best self, and
Mhm.
that she wanted more than the life she had. And they understood that. They really connected to that idea.
Mhm.
So yeah, I love trying to now I find that in my the second half of my teaching career, next year will be my 25th year as a teacher. I'm much more hopeful about students being able to connect to works that are well written. I worry less about like, will they like it? Will they not like it? Will they find something? Will they? And I think more about like, this is really well written. And to me, a well-written novel especially shows us something of ourselves, shows us something humane and of humanity. And so I trust that if they're giving it a solid try, they're going to find that in what they're
Mhm.
reading. It's one of the great pleasures of my life.
Mhm. I have to tell this little story as an aside, is that when I was in seventh grade, when my family had moved from Ohio to New Jersey, and I had been in like this gifted program in Ohio, and here I was in regular classes, which was fine, but I was bored and I was causing trouble. And my teacher, my English teacher, who was also named Mr. English, assigned me Jane Eyre to read in seventh grade. And it
Oh, wow.
yeah, totally turned me around. So I
Did you
get
like
that.
it?
I didn't get it, but I understood that he knew that I was bored and that I
Yeah.
could do more. And so he gave me a book that was hard, but I was up to that challenge. I read it again as an adult, and I was like, okay, now I get it. But I love that your students understood what was happening there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say, like, I scaffolded it for them. Like, we talked about it beforehand, which is something that I didn't experience enough when I was a student. I was often just, I had a very similar experience with Wuthering Heights that you did with Jane Eyre, where someone just sort of gave it to me and was like, it's a good book. And I was like, okay, and I'm a good reader. So, and then I was lost. To this day, I don't really know what happened in Wuthering Heights because I didn't get it at all. So I try to, I feel like that's one thing that an English teacher can do these days is help, or an English professor is help people access these works. Because it's hard. They're hard, even when you're a really smart person and a good reader.
Yeah. And one of the things that is a touchstone of this book, and we will get into the book in just a minute, is that you want people to rediscover the love of reading. And I was a children's librarian for a long time, and I saw the light go out in their eyes as they were assigned books that were too hard for them, that weren't interesting to them, things like that. So how do you think this book really addresses that?
It's a really great question, and something people have been asking me a lot. I have a lot of parents at my book events and talks saying to me, like, I love to read, you love to read, my kid doesn't love to read, I don't know what to do. And of course, I have no global response. Each child is different, each person is different. But I suspect that you're onto something in connecting the assigned reading to the dislike of reading. I have multiple essays in the book where I talk about I don't like being assigned reading. I didn't like it as a kid. I don't really like it now. When someone gives me a book, I'm kind of always like, okay, I guess I'll read it eventually. Even when I opt in to review a book, there's this, it's never as pure as just like enjoying the. But something I was really lucky about, and it just happened by happenstance, nobody taught this to me, is I, as a teenager, saw assigned reading as like the work that I have to do. I do this work, I have to read, I don't know, Wuthering Heights, or I have to read Romeo and Juliet or whatever. That's the work I'm doing for school. And I was a very good girl. I always did the work I was assigned. But simultaneously, my own reading, like they never drifted into each other. I always just did my own reading for fun, for enjoyment. I didn't let one kind of sully the other. And I don't know why that happened for me. I don't know why I particularly felt that way, because I think it is different than what a lot of people experience. But that's what I would encourage folks who are struggling with that themselves, or with, helping their child or a child in their life or youth in their life kind of like discover reading. It's like, don't expect them to feel that excitement and enthusiasm about a workbook they've been assigned that teaches them about different kinds of soil. Like that's not going to do it. But maybe they love YA about found families. Like maybe they love some, well, romance or fantasy or something that's just, they just love that. That's their thing. Like embrace that as like the actual love of reading. The assigned reading is something you got to do. It's probably helpful for you. It's good for you. But things, as we well know, things that are good for us aren't always the most enjoyable, right? But do the
Like
reading that you
broccoli.
really enjoy too, like whatever that is.
I was gonna say like broccoli, but
Yeah. I mean, I like it, but I didn't as a kid, right?
it's good for you though. But the thing is that like I think that you've probably heard this quote that nobody hates reading really. They just haven't found the right thing to read. Whether it's a book or a magazine or an article or even like my husband reads a lot of like not trade magazines, but like technical things. He likes it.
Yeah,
Let him do
absolutely.
it.
There wasn't room in the book to get into it, but like, I love magazines. I read magazines all the time, and you cannot tell me that like reading the New Yorker, which I faithfully do every week, isn't as good for me as being assigned some particular book and reading it. I'm not trying to say that everyone should love reading the New Yorker, but you're right, there's lots of text out there to be read. It doesn't all have to be, this heavy, solid book about something sad.
Right. And I think that's where I get very frustrated sometimes because people, I'm going to say teachers, but it's other people too, parents, will be like, well, graphic novels aren't reading, or this isn't reading, or an audiobook isn't reading. And I'm like, it is, it's all
Yeah, it is.
reading.
It is. It is. I mean, I don't have any strong argument besides like I say it is, so it is. Like it's are you
You're an expert, you wrote a book
consuming,
on
yeah,
it.
are you consuming literature? Like, is it narrative that is at least somewhat based on a written text that you are like creating some of the work within yourself with your imagination? Then to me that's reading. It totally counts.
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa has the same question I do because I feel this way. If you don't like assigned reading, do you belong to any book clubs?
I don't belong to any book clubs. It's a really great question, Lisa. Thank you for asking it. I don't belong to any book clubs because I would love if I have any Pittsburgh friends, if someone wants to invite me to a book club, that would be great. I didn't want to do it before I wrote this book because I thought I would dominate the conversation with my many opinions about reading, and I didn't want to be that person. Um, I also don't drink wine, so like one of the main benefits of book clubs is close to me. But I think the real reason, all joking aside, is my classes are kind of like book clubs for me. I wish one of my students could weigh in because I'm sure they're like, yeah, a book club I get a grade on, like I have to write papers for. What kind of book club is that? But for me, it feels it scratches that same itch of like we read this interesting, beautiful, difficult text together, and now we're gonna like pick it apart and talk about it. And what I hear you say about it or you say about it is gonna open it up for me in a way that I think a good book club does as well. So in many ways, I feel like I get that itch scratched from my job.
Well, and Mary Lou says that in the book you wrote, read whatever you want, whenever you want. And she loved that quote, which is, I love it as well.
Thank you, Mary Lou.
I'm going to go back a little bit. RP says, I can relate with the need to acknowledge the hunger of your own inner artist while being practical. As someone in their late 20s who's working in development for an arts nonprofit, but ultimately identifies as an artist myself, what advice do you have on beginning to pursue that without falling into the trap of too late?
It's such a great question, and I think about it a lot. So I can answer it sort of holistically and also personally. I'll start personally first, which is that I didn't go for my MFA in creative writing until I was 38 years old. I was 15 years older than multiple people in my class who had just come right out of undergrad. So like I had almost lived, like I was not the same generation as them. And I also was the exact same age or even slightly older than almost all of my professors in the MFA program, which they are all now my colleagues. So that's quite lovely. Like we all get along, but it takes some sort of inner strength to say to yourself, like, I am too old by society standards, but I am not too old by my own standards. And so I'm going to go and do this thing, whether it's going for an MFA or entering your work in a show, or even being like, I'm going to write that novel. I don't know if it's going to get published. I don't know if it's going to be any good, but I'm going to really actually sit down and do it. I'm going to write. I'm going to create. I'm going to be the artist that I think I am. I'm going to follow that dictate of my artist soul, right? So that's the sort of personal thing, is that you have to be a little bit brave and you have to just sort of go for it. But I think more holistically, like there is no too late.
No.
There's no too late at all. There's weird societal expectations that seem to get reinforced on Twitter a lot for some reason. But otherwise, there isn't anything. There's no reason why you can't start creating art at 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 or whatever it is that you want to do. Maybe, maybe you have lost some opportunity to write as a youth, but you are now at the point where you can see the world and the people and humanity and your own belief system and everything else that you want to bring into your creative work with so much more clarity. And you've been influenced by so many other artists and artworks in a way that just none of us is at 22, that your art is probably going to be even better and more sophisticated than you might think it's going to be.
Right.
you have to overcome the difficulty of the embarrassment of learning something new when you're old, which is not something we love in our society. We don't love that. But if you can get over that hump, yeah, why not? We need your art, we need your voice, and you
Mhm.
need your art more than anything else. So
Yeah,
go for it.
that's a great answer. Um, we have a bunch of questions, which I'm going to hold off on for right now because I do want to get into the book first. So, first of all, how did you get this idea for writing this book?
It's a great question. So after my first book came out, I did feel a little bit, I was always a little surprised that I had written a memoir that was not a genre that I necessarily expected to write. I really expected my first book would be a novel. Um, and so when it came to my second book and I was talking to my editor about like, and my agent about what should I write about? What should I write about? She was like, and then later he was like, you need to write something that you feel passionately enough about that you're not just writing an article with a lot of like treading water in it, like something that you can write 300 pages about without that feeling like, getting water from a stone. And I always joke that they wouldn't let me write a whole book about my love for Benedict Cumberbatch. So instead, I was
I would
like, oh,
that.
reading. It's very sad. I mean,
I
it's
would
still
be
out there, agent and editor, if you want to. Anyway, I reading was just something that I was like, I have a lot to say about reading. I feel like I have some level of expertise about it from being an English teacher for so long. It felt adjacent to my first book, but I also just felt so passionately about it. And finally, I would say in both my work as a librarian, as a library page, and as an adult reader, I have always really enjoyed reading books about books.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of them, you all know about them, like that book, I can never remember the title, but that great book about the lady who just read a shelf at the New York Society Library. She just read every book on a shelf and then wrote about it. Or often it's writers talking about like this book influenced me, or the great Nancy Pearl books about like here's 20 books about Alaska and here's 20 books about Arkansas and here's like I just have always enjoyed reading those books, and sort of daydreaming about a world in which I would actually have time to read all the books that are recommended to me. But I felt like I got a little taste of them from reading books about books. So all of that converged into what became Why We Read, like the
Yeah.
desire to write something I was passionate about, the desire to write about books. And as I was saying to you before we started the webinar, the great pleasure has turned out to be that I get to talk to lots of people who love books too. I didn't really anticipate that part of it. My first book came out during the pandemic, and I didn't get to talk to anyone
No,
about my book because nobody was talking to anyone about anything in June of 2020. And so this has just been so delightful to not only talk to readers, but talk to people who are like, have you read this? Have you read that? You should read this. I love books too. I had the same feeling. It's a delight.
that's wonderful. And the other thing you had said earlier was that your TBR pile is about to fall over because of all of those recommendations. So
Yeah.
I love it.
I
Okay,
have a
so
lot of time in like libraries and used bookstores as well. Like as I've been doing my events, I keep like hunting and gathering, hunting and gathering.
there goes your entire whatever it's called, not forward, but advance.
True. It's just sort of taking over.
That's right. Well, at least you're buying books and not, something bad. Um, so one of the things that you had mentioned doing is reading maybe a bit of your book to us.
Sure, I would love to do that. Maybe I'll just read some of the preface for folks who are not familiar or folks who are familiar with it. Okay, I turned to the wrong page. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. It's called Why I Read. I don't remember a time when I didn't know how to read. My grandmother, an elementary school teacher, taught me when I was 2. You were ready, was my mom's matter-of-fact response the one time I asked her why. 2 is before my memories really began, young enough to make reading seem less a hobby and more of a way of life. I breathed, I ate, I cried, I slept, I chatted, I read. And I have not stopped reading since. When I asked my creative writing students at the University of Pittsburgh to tell me stories about themselves as readers, I hear anecdotes like that one. They too were constantly exhorted by nearby adults to put down their books and look around on family trips. I nearly missed spotting Old Faithful in Yellowstone because I was nose deep in a Nancy Drew book. They too chose reading over most other activities, and like me, many were punished for minor infractions by having books taken away for a day, leaving us to watch television, the horror, for entertainment. They too packed and still pack multiple books for many trips of more than a city block in distance, although e-readers have helped save all of our backs, thankfully. Like me, they read and continue to read at any and all lulling moments of life. On the toilet, brushing one's teeth, in line at the post office, on any form of public transportation, by audiobook when driving.
Mhm.
Like the Russian proverb about how one fisherman spots another from 100 yards away, I feel a familial affection for my fellow longtime intense readers. We are kin, quiet, introspective, tea and cozy quilt loving kin. While some of my students are finding their way back to reading for pleasure, I never stop. I still read while I brush my teeth, squinting my middle-aged eyes inches from the book, and still bring 3 times the number of books I could possibly read on any trip, including my daily commute to campus. I still visit the library, okay, 2 different libraries every week. Truly one of the greatest honors of my life that the librarians recognize me on site and start checking out my books on hold when I walk in. All these years later, I still define myself as a reader. I'll stop there.
That's wonderful. And I think so many of us can really relate to that, of just always being a reader, having a book that keeps us from having to interact with people we don't want to, or, it's just a safe place.
Just to pass the time in many ways. I have this very distinct memory of living in New York City and needing to mail something at the post office. I think it was around the holidays. I had to go to the post office. There was no other way to do it. And the line was like doubled around, tripled around and out the door, and it was cold outside. And people were just nonstop complaining about it. Everybody had something better to be doing, which I understand. I'm sure I did as well. But I had this book I was reading. It was a really good book. I don't remember what it was, but I was reading that book and I mean, I probably stood there for an hour just like slowly moving around, and I don't know, it didn't bother me at all. I was so happy to have that time to read. Like what a gift books give us to pass the time better.
Absolutely. And for somebody like I was super shy when I was a kid, books were my haven and libraries were my place. So I totally get that. Now this book is basically a series of essays and your observations. So what was your favorite essay?
Oh boy, I really like the one someone referenced it in the chat about the rules of reading that I wrote in sort of a Lord of the Rings style parody, which now that I hear that out loud sounds very weird, but please read the book. I think it's quite delightful. I really wanted to dig into a lot of you referenced this earlier, a lot of the rules that people kind of place on reading and on each other, that like real readers do this, real readers use bookmark, real readers don't listen to audiobooks, real readers don't read.
That one is true, the bookmark one.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Do not write in library books, as I'm always telling my students, don't dog ear the pages. Like, yeah. But in general, like, I feel like those can be kind of gatekeeping to keep people from enjoying reading. And so in that essay, I really try to kind of crack that open a little bit and of course use logic, like don't write in a book that's not your book. But it's like whatever it is you want to do besides that is fine. Like, just read the book however you want. Fine. So I'm fond of that essay a lot. And I also really enjoyed the essays earlier in the book when I got to think about my childhood and remember the libraries of my youth and going with my mom to the library and all those kinds of things. So they were lovely to write as well. Yeah, and I'll give you just one more. Sorry. The other one I really loved was I wrote about George Saunders' novel, Lincoln in the Bardo. That's towards the end of the book, which it's a wonderful and incredibly challenging book that he himself has said is challenging. I'm not saying anything that he doesn't know. And I loved just remembering what it was like to read the book with my students and how that was. Yeah.
Was there any story that you told that you were surprised that you wanted in the book?
We're surprised. It's so interesting you asked that because I've been working on my proposal for my third book,
Mhm.
which I think it's going to be about being hearing impaired and being hard of hearing. And I realized that so in this book, in the second book, when I talk about, if I had read further on in the preface, I talk about being born with hearing loss and how that really became, I think, one of the reasons why I love to read is because reading, like, as I say, like it never asked me to repeat. It never was sorry that I was asking to repeat. Reading never like was unclear. I could reread if I didn't understand. It was just a really helpful way for me to get information and to feel safe as a child and probably still as an adult as well. And I had not thought about that before. I really only happened when I sat down to write. To go back to what I was saying earlier about like I write sometimes to find out what it is I think. I really sat down and I thought about the question of the title that my editor and I had agreed on. Why do I read? You know, why is it? And that's when I sort of realized that about being hearing impaired, which is not something I've ever written about in any way before. And so that was really powerful and interesting for me. I was quite surprised to see that come out.
Mhm.
And I'm really pleased that it's in the book. People connect to it a lot. I've had a lot of great conversations about it.
Oh, that's wonderful. What about a story that you told that made you cry or made you sad, or you've heard from other people made them sad?
Yeah. There's an essay in there about reading Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal,
Mm,
which is, yeah. I mean, if you read it, I think that's the noise everyone makes. It's such a beautiful and powerful book, and it's so hard in
mhm.
many ways. I point out in my book of how often it's not bleak, it's just matter of fact. It's just saying like our bodies will like give up on us at some point, no matter how militant you are about eating healthy and exercising, you know, something is going to get you. We are all mortal. That is the premise of the book and of our lives. And I've had multiple people, and I connect in my book, I connect that book to my own father's illness and passing about 8 years ago. Um, and so that was painful to remember when writing it. And I also have had people mention to me that they related to that in losses that they have sustained in their own lives. So yeah, I don't think it's a bleak essay, but I think it's a tough one.
Mhm. It also sounds very human. Um, so
Yeah.
you are a humorist. Was there any particular story that just made you like roll on the floor laughing?
Oh, I still laugh so hard when I think about I tell the story better in the book, but I had a student. I tell it actually kind of briefly in the book. It was longer in real life, but I had this wonderful student. I call her Carla in the book, who absolutely loved books. She loved reading. She was super into manga. But one time I told her like, "Oh, you should go." She wanted, I can't remember, some classic book, and I was like, "Oh, you should go get it out of the school library." And she was like, "That library is whack." And I was like, "Yeah, it was a terrible library. It was falling
Oh,
apart. Bookshelves were literally falling over. It didn't have an assigned librarian. There was graffiti on the walls and everything." So I was like, "Oh, well, go to a public library. Go to a public library." And she was like, "No, Ms. Reed, like I don't mess with public libraries." Like it, and in the moment she said it almost like, you know, things went down at the public library. And I was like, but it turned out she didn't know that public libraries were free.
hmm.
She thought she had to pay, and she did not have any money. So she did not want to pay. She thought they kind of worked like a bookstore, basically. And so I had this sort of amazing and pretty hilarious conversation with her where I was kind of like, no, it's free. You have to provide something with your address and you get a card and then you get things like that. And she was just like, do I have to bring them back? And I was like, yeah, you get like a certain period of time you have to bring them back. And she was like, what? And as they say in the book, like if you think about it, of course that makes no sense. Like that's not true in any other part of life. Like no store's like, oh, take these shirts, wear them, bring them back. That's great, no problems. Like of course it made no sense to
Mhm.
her. Um, but was hilarious to me because I've been going to the public library all my life. So yeah, I tell the rest of the story in the book, but it worked out great for her.
It's one of those, if you know, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I'm gonna
She
ask.
seemed like I had unlocked the world to her, which I guess I had
Yeah,
in a sense, but wow.
yeah. So, what I have one last question. I'm going to start asking questions from the audience. More questions from the audience is, we talked about gatekeepers a little bit. Um, I have a real problem with people saying, "Oh, that's not a good book to read. Oh, nobody reads romance. Nobody reads sci-fi. Nobody should read horror." Let's say if you're not reading literary fiction, it's not, real reading. So what do you say to somebody who's like, "Oh, you shouldn't be reading that. Nobody reads that."
I mean, I don't say anything because no one tells me that.
Oh, somebody told me that because
No,
I'm
I mean that like very genuinely. I tried super hard to be an advocate from like day one in my classroom of being like, everybody gets to read whatever it is they want. I am assigning you books. You've chosen to take this class. You should read what I assigned you because I've been thoughtful about it. We're gonna have a lot of good conversations about it. But I don't care what you read. If you want to read, like smutty fantasy, you go ahead and do that. That's great. And I also really try to advocate within my faculty as well, because I work with some of the most amazing literary fiction writers on my faculty, and I adore them and I love the work that they're doing. And I sometimes like write poop jokes for the internet, These are two very different worlds of writing. But I really love to think about the fact, like the vast immensity we contain within us, which is that my colleague who writes beautiful literary fiction might also like to write some poop jokes sometimes. And I, a writer of poop jokes, might really like to write some literary fiction sometimes. And that's fine. Like we are vast. We contain multitudes, right? We can be that as readers as well. You can absolutely read, whatever it is that you think is kind of trashy. I'm not saying it's trashy. You're saying it's trashy. You can also read Lincoln and the Bardo. Your brain is big and can do lots of different things. Like it doesn't have to be just one thing. So it is truly not a question that people ask me that often. I think because I am so quick to, as you can see, get very impassioned about it. But that is what I would say, that like the wonderful thing about books is that you get to keep reading them. You don't just choose one for the rest of your life. So if you want to, I just read Mother Daughter Murder Club, the Mother Daughter Murder
Oh,
Club, I
okay.
think it's called. And it is not, I enjoyed that book. It is not a book of like complexity that's going to win it a Pulitzer Prize, but it was a super fun, interesting, well-written book to read.
Mhm.
Now I'm going to read something that's a little bit more challenging. That's fine too. Like it's all good. You can read all kinds of different things.
Mhm. I love it because there are so many people that have like they have things to say about any, and social media has really,
Yes.
mm. But this actually goes to Rachel's question of how do you recommend expanding your reading life, both in quantity as well as diversity of types of books?
It's such a great question. I think about that a lot because I don't want to be somebody who's only reading certain kind of book over and over. Because I have 2 theater degrees, I have read tons of plays. I've read almost every Shakespeare play. I've not written, lots of Chekhov, but I have not written, boy, now I can't tell the difference between writing and reading. I have not read a lot of books that are considered classics or part of the Western canon. Um, I've never read Ulysses, for example. I have never read the Canterbury Tales. I'm not saying that, like, I think I'm a good reader, even having not read those, but I do think about, like, how can I kind of come back to some of those books and read them if I want to give them a try. And so the first thing I would say is it's really helpful to have a team helping you find what it is you want to read. Like librarians like yourself love to help people find what it is they're going to read. If for some reason you don't have a librarian that you can go to Ask a Librarian at the New York Public Library online, or I'm sure other libraries have it as well. And you can say, I do this all the time. Like, I'll be like, I'm in the mood to read a book about medieval or earlier Irish history. Help? And they will give me 3 or 4 books that I can then order up from my library. Also, booksellers are really helpful if you can talk to them about what kind of, to literally say to them, like, I mostly read fantasy. I'm interested in reading some realistic fiction. Help? They're going to have some books to recommend to you, which is absolutely amazing. I would just ask that you actually buy them at that bookstore and don't go home and order them from Amazon. You also, I think it's really helpful to think about your own stages in life and within your year. So, for example, as I mentioned, my father passed away 8 years ago. For basically 5 years after that, I really couldn't read anything that was about a death of a parent. I just didn't matter if the book was good or bad or well written or poorly written. I could not read it. It was too emotionally damaging for me. That's fine. Like, now I'm in a place where I can do that again. Absolutely fine. Don't force yourself past like your own desires. And in terms of the year, I just wrote a piece for the Los Angeles Times about this. Like, I do the opposite of what beach reads are supposed to be. I can't read anything heavy during the school year. I'm reading my students' work. Sometimes I'm reviewing books. I'm often writing myself. Like, my brain is tired. I just want to read Jane Austen.
Hmm.
Yeah, like, I just want to read Christina Lauren's book about cowgirls, like finding treasure. That's all I want. Those books are perfection. They're great. They're lighter. And then in the summer, I want to read like Columbine by David Cullen, or 5 Days at Memorial, the book about the Hurricane Katrina disaster. Like, that's when I can dig in and really get into those books. So, like, follow your own bliss as well. If you're only giving yourself a big, heavy, intense book to read because you think you should be reading it, don't do that. Find something else that you would enjoy reading.
Mhm.
And then the final tip I have for that is, this is where online is actually good. Go to someone or go to an online source, Google it, ask on Reddit. Like, I've never read any fantasy. What's some good fantasy for me to read? I would definitely ask my best friend that. He reads tons of fantasy. And in fact, I have asked him and he's recommended a couple books to me. And I read them. They're still not really my jam, but at least I feel like I have a better idea of like what good fantasy writing feels like. You can do that with any genre. You can go to someone who loves Anne Patchett and be like, which of her books am I going to like the most? And that person would be delighted to help you.
Oh, yeah. There's also an online source called What Should I Read Next? You can put in any title or book that you've liked, and they will list a bunch of other books that are like that. I use that all the time. And so that brings us to Brendan's question about what are you most looking forward to reading this summer?
It's a really great question. I'm going to start digging into some research for my third book. It's going to have a little bit more medical and scientific stuff in it, which I actually really love incorporating research. I just haven't had to do it very much in my first 2 books because I was the research. So I'm super excited about like finding some books about disability, differently abled people. I'm super interested in reading about universal design for all, which is a concept that's exactly what it sounds like. It's like, how can we make our living and working spaces more accessible for people who have all kinds of different capacities and abilities, and something I've been interested in for a long time, but I haven't actually been able to do much research on. I also lead a group at Pitt for faculty who identify as disabled or chronically ill, or both, as I do. And I found some great books about like what it means to be a disabled teacher or chronically ill teacher. And I'm super excited about reading those as well. I know that sounds really heavy, but like I said, in the summer, that's when I'm like, yes, I get to get into it. I get to really. I also have the annotated copy of Persuasion by Jane Austen, which I'm excited to read.
That would be awesome. By the way, I love Christina Lauren as well. I can read them anytime.
They're
So
so good.
Anne asks the most controversial question. If you have a choice to read from an ebook versus a physical book, which do you prefer?
That's a really great question. It would depend on the situation. I just was in Brooklyn for a few days, and when I'm in Brooklyn, I love my e-reader. I love being able to just take a bag, pop that e-reader in, and have access, to like a dozen different books there on the train coming home. I could switch between a book that I'm reading just for my own pleasure and a book that I'm reading more for my work. So I do love an ebook. I also I need readers now, which is very funny. And ebooks, you can change the font up and down, and I appreciate that. Like I've been in the doctor's office and I don't want to be taking my readers off and on. I love that I can actually size it up large enough
Mhm.
to I can read it. That said, I mean, we all know there's nothing like a physical book, right? Like the heft, the feeling of like moving through those pages and knowing like, oh, I'm halfway, or oh, I'm almost done. Like that's beautiful too. So I'm truly agnostic. Both are good.
Well, I was going to say that a physical book, I'm an e-reader user because my eyes are so bad, but the
Yeah.
in a physical book, you actually pay attention more to
Mhm.
some degree. Like you're not just flipping through it really quickly to get to the end.
Yeah, I think that I don't know. I do love in an ebook that you can highlight as well and hold on to quotes. They both are really good. I truly don't have a preference. They're both really good. Just as long as
Gotcha.
I have something, I'm happy.
Yep. What about audio?
Such a great question. I usually do not listen to audiobooks, and I have absolutely nothing against audiobooks. I have listened to them. I think they're great. I'm not an audio learner. My hearing is not good, and sometimes I think it's more of a reluctance to take out a book that then I struggle to be able to understand the narrator, or I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to follow what they're saying, and I just tend not to like even want to take that risk. That said, I do have an essay in the book about listening to the entire Harry Potter series on audio. Again, shortly after my father passed away, and I was commuting about 2 hours to a teaching job, and they were really meaningful and beautiful to me. So I'm certainly not against audiobooks. It's just not quite my jam.
Yeah. I do have to say too that a good narrator can make an audiobook and a bad narrator can ruin it for you. So,
I have heard that from many people. I've also had multiple people ask me why I don't read the audio of my own book. And so I just want to say, like, people, I hear you. The next book, I will ask if I can do the audio narrative for it. I know I have a distinctive voice that maybe would be beneficial to people hearing the book. I love both my audiobooks, though. I think the narrators are quite good.
well, just the little bit that you read to us before, I mean, your pacing is perfect, your intonation, I loved it. So,
Thank you.
do it. Pierre asks about writing. How necessary is a formal education to an aspiring writer? In addition to prolific reading, what are ways writers without access to higher education can learn about writing, publishing, and other information useful to a career in writing?
It's a good question. I'm sorry to say that I'm not deeply qualified to answer it because I do work in higher education. So I end up having students who are following that path. So all I can really say is that I agree that higher education, specifically getting a BFA or an MFA, is not necessary to your artistic pursuits as a writer. I do think that the best thing any writer can do, whether they're in a higher education program or not, is read as much as possible. It is not a coincidence that it's not a coincidence that I started reading The New Yorker when I was 14 years old. I had it in my head that like that was something writers were supposed to do. Like you read The New Yorker, so I subscribed to The New Yorker. I did not understand The New Yorker. I really only understood like the restaurant reviews. I would be like, steak, got it. I understand what that is, and everything else was just kind of a blur. But I read it like, and that reading over years and years like taught me the style of the New Yorker, what happens in Talk of the Town, what happened in the profiles, what happened in the humor column. And so I don't think it's coincidental that I was then able, after much practice and hard work, to get my writing in the New Yorker because I understood on some like really gut level what it is that they were looking for, what it meant to write that kind of work. And I think that whatever it is that you want to write can teach you how to write it by your reading of it.
Mhm.
And the other thing I would say is I would encourage anyone, both students, the students I have, but students in creative writing programs and anyone, to find a group that you can share your writing with, and that you can be a good reader to the people in that group. That is something I only had briefly myself, but I think it's a really vital part of learning to be a writer, is to hear, just to read others' works in progress and understand what a draft looks like and how no one is doing really great on their first draft, but also to start to understand like how your work is perceived by others, how they talk about it, what they think it is that you're doing, what they think is unique about your voice is really helpful as well. And
Mhm.
it's also just nice to have a community. Writing's very lonely work.
Yeah, and creating a team, maybe,
Yeah,
especially if you're self-publishing. I've heard that having a team is really important.
I think that's true. The people who are in my writers group were friends of mine already, but I just saw them when I was in Brooklyn. And again, like, you know, they're really happy for me. Like they feel a sense of ownership over my writing career, and sure, they helped to make it.
Wonderful. Catherine just asked really quickly, can you share the title of the book, about being differently abled teacher? My daughter's hearing impaired teacher, chemistry and math of gifted children, and I'd like to suggest it to her.
That is such a great question, and I'm so sorry I do not remember the titles of the books. I tried to kind of skid by how I didn't quite remember the title. If you would like to email me, it's sreed151@gmail.com. My last name, SREED151@gmail.com. I will look them up and I will send those titles to you.
Okay.
So
It's also in our program description, but I will put it in the chat as well. So what you said the next book are you just starting the research, or do you think you'll be starting to write it pretty soon?
It's a great question. I am at the proposal stage. So I sent a proposal to my agent who will look it over and then we'll send it on to my editor. I think we're all agreed that we want to continue to work together. My editor is amazing. My agent is as well. And the team at Hanover Square Press has been beyond what any reasonable expectation of like hard work on behalf of my book could be. They have all been amazing. So I would love to continue to work with them. At the same time, we've talked a lot about writing tonight, but publishing and writing are not the same thing, right? Like there's a different business, and we have to think through that part of it as well. So I'm hopeful. I think while they go through the business, I probably will have some revisions to do on the proposal, and then while they kind of go through the business of deciding whether they want to buy the book and go through the contracts and all that kind of thing, I think I'm going to turn my attention to working on my novel for the rest of the summer.
Oh,
I've
perfect.
had that going for a while, and I would love to get back to it a little bit.
And we just have another minute, and I really want to know if there's any book recommendations you would like to give us, something that we could read into the night.
Oh, I should have looked at my Goodreads account before I came on, because now I'm drawing a blank, of course. I mean, I will tell you, like, I have a huge stack of books sitting over there in my library across from me that I got from the library and I picked up at various book events that I've been at. I really enjoyed reading Mary Beth Keene's latest book, The Half Moon,
Oh,
which is she's the writer of Ask Me Again, Yes, I believe
perfect.
is. I might not have that title quite right. Um, Let me think about it. Again, email me if you want to know what it is. But yeah, I had heard her read at Booktopia in Vermont, and I picked up her new book, The Half Moon. It's about a bar in outside of New York City, and it's very Irish Catholic. It's really great. I really enjoyed it. That was a world I taught in for a while, so I enjoyed reading about that. I also have been reading some Richard Russo. I just read Nobody's Fool, and I have Somebody's Fool. No, I have Everybody's Fool is the second one, queued up on my Kindle to read that one next. I sort of realized that I hadn't read enough. This is going to sound horrible. I've not read enough like white male authors. I almost always read women identifying writers or queer writers or, diverse writers in an attempt to introduce them to my students. I'm always reading. So I have actually like never read any Philip Roth. I've never read any Richard Russo. And so I decided that I would read Empire Falls last fall, and I really liked it. So I'm going to keep working my way through the Russo novels as I get to them. I like I like they can be a little sexist. I don't love that. But I recognize the people in them. They feel
Mhm.
like people from my hometown, even though his books are set in New York or Maine.
So Barb
That's
says, ask.
again, thank you. Asking again. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Very, very bad disrespect.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Shannon. I have had a ball. I hope other people have. I've enjoyed everybody's stories in the chat and the recommendations. And I look forward to everything that you write in the future ever, because you're just amazing.
Thank you so much. I have enjoyed this conversation so much. Anytime anybody is like, hey, come in and talk about books, I'm like, yes, I will be there. Thank you. So thank you to you for asking such interesting, insightful questions. Thank you to the people who have also asked me great questions. I really have just had a blast. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I hope you all have a wonderful night and happy reading, because read what you want. Just enjoy. Good
Absolutely.
night,
Thank
everybody.
you.